Don Watkins is an objectivist intellectual who recently appreciated a video I made about GameStop. You may have watched it, but Don Watkins was a huge fan of the video, and he said, just be sure to mention me in every one of my videos, and I'll have a fan for life. And little does Don know that I have mentioned him multiple times in previous videos. I'm a huge fan of Don's works and his books that he has co-written with Yaron Brook. And I bring this up because I'm going to mention Don Watkins in today's video because back in 2019, Don Watkins was featured in a few videos on Improve the Planet where he may have foreshadowed some recent events in Texas.
So, when partisans have really pointed to Texas often as an example of wind success, and that's because Texas produces more wind than any other U.S. state, and by one estimate, it supplied about 15% of the state's total electricity in 2017. But I think if you look closer at it, Texas actually reveals the real problems with depending on unreliables. And so not just the cost problem, but also the reliability of the grid. And so a lot of this I'm taking from a Count on Coal Council report, which there obviously have vested interests. But as far as I know, the facts that I am aware of, this checks out. But if anybody objects to any of them, let us know. But they point out that in February, there was an increase in heating demand because of cooler weather, and there were calmer winds.
This was February of 2019, again.
Expected. And so there was 20%, and there were calmer winds than expected. And so there was 20% less power than was expected coming from the wind turbines. And as a result, spot electricity prices, which are just like the short-term wholesale price of electricity in northern Texas, went up by 700%. And the bigger concern that's going on here is that the reserve margin of power in Texas is very thin. So that's the excess supply of energy that's available to maintain the grid if you have an unexpected increase in demand. And that's down to 7.4%, which is half of their target. And when it was even higher than that,
half their target,
the chairwoman of the state's Public Utility Commission was calling this situation very scary.
Very scary, folks. This was 2019.
The smaller your reserve margin, the more likely you're going to face brownouts and blackouts and price spikes. And I think that an underlying factor that's...
So it sounds like back in 2019, Texas's grid was vulnerable to brownouts and price spikes.
Really played a key role in creating this situation is that Texas has just closed down a bunch of coal in recent years. About 20% of their coal fleet was shut down. In fact, I think a little bit more than that as of this year. And so their grid is in an increasingly precarious position. And that's not something that you would...
The grid is in an increasingly precarious position. This was 2019.
See if you just looked at prices alone. And I think that's something that we should always be aware of. And one of the things we've been working at CIP is, well, how do you measure this issue of how resilient is the grid versus how precarious is it? How at risk are we of facing blackouts and brownouts? Because people have not really come up with a good way to measure this. But if you're concerned about energy, I mean, this is like one of the most, if not the most important factors about electricity that we'd be concerned about.
In general, as an advancing society, we would want our reserve margin to go up. I mean, unless you just...
Now that's Alex Epstein.
Just had some incredible mitigating technology, like, okay, you could exactly predict everything, or everything was that much more reliable.
So back in 2019, the reserve margin was already thin, lower than where it needed to be. And the head of the Utilities Commission in Texas said it was very scary. So that was April of 2019, almost 2 years ago. Let's jump ahead to August of 2019. Let's see what Don has to say here.
In a past episode of Power Hour, we talked about how Texas has been shutting down coal plants and replacing them with mostly wind turbines, and that last summer this led to people being quite worried about blackouts. And we also noted that wind apologists dismissed those concerns, and certainly after were quite triumphant about, look, see, there was no problems. Well, early last week, wind power generation in the region plunged for 3 days straight while temperatures hovered around 100, and the electricity grid in Texas was under so much strain that Texas was the single most expensive place to buy power in the United States. Wholesale electric price.
So Texas, at some point during these inconsistencies, they are at times the most expensive. Texas becomes the most expensive state to buy electricity. Meanwhile, the governor of Texas, Republican Governor Greg Abbott, he brags about how much of Texas's electricity and energy comes from wind.
Prices, for example, jumped up. This is not a typo. 36,000%, and reached as high as $9,000 a megawatt hour, and averaging over $6,500 a megawatt hour over Texas, with like the lowest price being $250 a megawatt hour. And just to give some context on what those numbers mean, at the same time in surrounding areas, you saw a range from 17 cents a megawatt hour, and I think that was in Louisiana, all the way up to about $61.95, I think, in the Chicago area. And so why were prices going so high? Well, it's because the supply of energy was so constrained in Texas, and that without those high energy prices, Texas would have had to resort to more aggressive energy deprivation measures in order to keep the lights on in Texas. And in fact, they actually did start to resort to some of those measures. So on Tuesday, the grid operator asked customers to voluntarily reduce their use of air conditioning, limit the amount of large appliances they were using, schedule pool pumps to run during off-peak times. And had things gotten any worse, Texas was ready to resort to telling businesses to shut down, which is called industrial.
So this sounds like it's been an ongoing problem where the state has been advising customers to watch their energy uses, and according to Don, they were close to shutting down businesses due to problems with electricity.
Demand response, which we've also talked about in the show, and ultimately resort to rotating outages. And so one of the things I want to stress from this story is that it's not like we face a choice between, oh, you have these widespread blackouts that completely bring the state to a standstill, or a grid to a standstill, and then everything else is just fine. That in order to avoid widespread blackouts, a grid overloaded with wind and solar, it has to resort to all sorts of painful measures, from high prices to voluntary energy deprivation to industrial energy deprivation to rotating energy outages, in order just to avoid a complete catastrophe. And one of the things I find really troubling is that these stories don't get a lot of attention, because these are warnings.
Yeah, they sure don't, do they?
Signals.
These are warning signals, Don says.
And it allows wind and solar supporters to go on and say, hey, look, there weren't any widespread blackouts, the system's fine. But actually what we're seeing is that it's becoming super vulnerable, particularly in...
It's becoming super vulnerable, folks. And would you look at what happened in Texas last week? Their electricity system failed because of unusual weather events, and now Texans are suffering, as many people on social media and the media are pointing fingers. Some people are pointing fingers at capitalism and deregulation.
You're a liar!
Even though coal plants have been shutting down in Texas for over a decade, as the state has subsidized and mandated wind and solar energy, as Watkins noted in the videos I showed. And I've seen other sources confirm this. Back in last November 2020, it was announced that a coal power plant in East Texas is closing down due to environmental regulations. And according to Alex Epstein, Texas has no plans to add nuclear power plants or coal power plants, but they do have plans to add more wind and solar. And hopefully Texas changes their plans after recent events, because as it turns out, the Electricity Reliability Council of Texas was notified over a decade ago that power plants need to be weatherized. They need to be prepared for bad weather events, adding that a federal report recommended installing heating elements around pipes, because that's been another issue. Pipes have been freezing and bursting in Texas. Also suggested increasing the amount of reserve power. And maybe if they would have invested in some of these recommendations, maybe they would not have had the problems they've been having. But instead, such funds were diverted into subsidizing unreliables like solar and wind. And apparently this shift in Texas began all the way back in 1999, when then Governor George W. Bush, you may have heard of him, he started the Renewable Portfolio Standard for Texas. And this was signed in 1999, which established mandates and goals for renewable energy. And let me be clear, I am not saying that frozen wind turbines caused this crisis, although I'm sure they played a role. My point is that when you consider the state's ridiculous obsession over shifting toward wind and solar, while neglecting warning signs like suggestions to weatherize and vulnerability issues that have been noticeable for years, it's ridiculous to blame this crisis on capitalism and deregulation. That said, it is time to throw in the towel on these worthless wind turbines. Even Germany has had problems since transitioning toward wind energy while closing down nuclear power plants following Fukushima. And this is a page from Alex Epstein's book, The Moral Case for Fossil Fuels. And as you can see, Germany is constantly having to pay their neighbors to take electricity off their hands to avoid power outages. And they're constantly having to shut down and restart their coal power plants to deal with the unpredictable supply of wind energy. Denmark has also rejected nuclear and fossil fuel energy in favor of wind energy. And now the Danes and the Germans pay the most for electricity in Europe.
Uh-oh, SpaghettiOs!
Give it up, you wind warriors. Wind is a waste. I, for one, love fossil fuels, but I understand that a lot of people are concerned about climate change and want to reduce their carbon footprint. And if that's the case, the way to go, if hydroelectricity is not available, because there's only so many rivers in the world, the way to go is nuclear.